So let's spend a few minutes on Noach. As you can see from the handout, I'll just hold it up for the camera. You've got beautiful pictures in color of the Orev and the Yonah, of the raven and the dove. Okay? And it's curious, Noach, the first thing he does in order to see if the water has abated is he sends out a raven. Would that have been your first choice of birds? I don't know. I mean, I like to think that Yonah was a very optimistic person, hopeful person. I mean, you certainly would have to be if you're going to start humanity all over again. So why does he choose a black, dark bird of the night as the first bird to send out? If you look at the psukim in the middle of Perek Ches, starting with Pasuk Vav and going through Pasuk Yud Beis, you'll see that he first sends out the Orev, Vayishalach es Orev, and Vayetze Yatzav Ashov, Hadivoshes Hamayim Me'al Haaretz. It goes to and fro. Okay, and looking for dry land. Then there are 3 times when Noach sends out a Yonah, sends out a dove. Vayishalach es hayonah mi'ito. Then he sends out the dove to see if the water has alighted. But the Yonah cannot find any vegetation, and so he brings it back into the teva. If he thought that sending out the raven was a good idea, why then, did he change from a raven to a dove? And if he saw that the dove didn't come back with anything, then why didn't he try a third bird? So the whole thing is difficult to understand. So then it says that he waited 7 days in Pasuk Yud, and then he sends out the Yonah a second time. And at that point, the Yonah comes back with an olive branch in its mouth. That's what Pasuk Yud Aleph. And then Pasuk Yud Beis is Noach waits another 7 days, and then he sends out the Yonah, the dove, one more time. This is the 3rd time sending out the Yonah, and the Yonah doesn't come back. And so therefore, Noach knows that there's dry land, there's ample dry land for them to anchor and to get off the teva. Now, there are several interpretations that the Meforshim offer as to why Noach sends a raven first before sending out the dove. The Radak has an interesting interpretation based just on the Pshat. He says, Vayishalach es ha'orev, the source number 2, Amar ha'orev ochel basar, v'yimtza nevelot ha'adam v'ha'behema. So it was very pragmatic. He said, all of living life has perished in the flood. There must be cadavers bobbing up and down in the water. Let me see if the raven is a predatory bird. It's a flesh eater, not like a dove, which only is a vegetarian. Is that the right word? It's a herbivore. I guess that's more the correct word. Birds are not vegetarians. Human beings are vegetarians. It's a herbivore. Okay. And so he says, V'im yachzeru kol kach hamayim she'imatzei nevelot she'im mushlachim ba'aretz yavi b'fiv shum basar v'neda ki chasru hamayim. He says the thinking was not so much that the cadavers are bobbing in the water, but they must have sunk by now. And if the raven will be able to find some flesh, that'll be a sign that the waters have begun to abate. V'shalcho v'lo hevi davar b'fiv. So he sends it out, and then the raven doesn't find anything. So why then does he send the Yonah afterwards, the dove? He figures if there's not enough dry land to find flesh, maybe there's some vegetation that the dove will be able to find, and that might be easier. So he changed strategies from using a carnivorous bird to a bird that would seek out vegetation, and that way that was a change in strategy. The Gemara tells us that in a very, very bizarre description of Noach having a conversation with the Orev, that the Orev was sinful in some way. There were certain creatures who sinned on on the Teva. The Gemara describes 3 creatures on the Teva who violated the rule that everyone has to be chaste and cannot be with their mate on the Teva: the dog, the raven, and Noach's son Ham. So it almost implies, although the Gemara doesn't say this outright, but the Gemara almost implies that Noach was sort of sending out the raven as a punishment for not being chaste on the Teva. In other words, you weren't able to discipline yourself, so I'm going to send you out as my guinea pig, because this is almost like a punishment mission. But I want to share a thought that sort of requires us to think a little bit more deeply into the overarching theme of what is going on over here. Noach is being given the task of recreating the world, but not really recreating it, but repopulating the world, rebuilding the world. A world that already exists, but is now going to exist differently from the way it existed before. And there are a number of ways to understand how Hashem is changing the world in order to make sure that the same mistakes that man has made in the past do not recur in the future. And I believe that one of the ways of looking at the psukim is that Hashem wants Noach to participate in this recreation event, so that whereas before God was the sole creator of heaven and earth, and Hashem was responsible for the 6 days of creation, Hashem is cueing Noach that if we want to make sure that the same problems do not recur, we have to give man responsibilities that he didn't have before. There's this concept in Judaism of Nahama Dikisufa. Nahama Dikisufa literally means the bread of shame. And what it basically means is that when you give people things without them having to work for it, it does not necessarily lead to very good results. And we see this many times in welfare state situations, when people are used to being on the dole and constantly taking without having to do anything in order to work for their daily bread. We sometimes see that breeds or engenders bad behavior. It engenders laziness, it engenders a sense of complacency and entitlement, which could eventually become corrupt. That's not to say that welfare is bad. There's a need for welfare in every society. There's a need for tzedakah in every society. But the objective has to be that tzedakah or welfare, whatever it is a temporary remedy for a person or family or community that is in a dire situation. And in order to help them get past this rough spot, we need to help them. And then once they've been able to get back on their feet again, we help the next person, and we tell the person that we've helped, now you go and help someone else now that you're back on your feet. That's the way that tzedakah is supposed to work. But when Hashem first created the world, man was not involved at all in the creation process. Man was plopped into the Garden of Eden with this great sense of just being the recipient and not doing anything to chart his own destiny. And even after man is ejected from the garden, there is that sense of, well, everything is just here on a silver platter for our taking. There's nothing that we really have to do to earn our keep. The world is luxurious even after the sin of Adam and Chava, even though Hashem says, by the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. But yes, it's true that now man has to work hard to grow crops, but at the same time, life is fantastic, and there's really very little that man has contributed to the creation of the world. I think that one way of looking at these psukim is that this whole story of the raven and the dove is a recreation of the Genesis story of the first few psukim of Parshas Bereshis. So if we go back and we look at the very beginning of Perek Ches, where it talks about how now the flood is abating. Source number 4. Pasuk Aleph in Perek Ches says, Vayiskor Elokim es Noach. Hashem remembers Noach. Ve'es kol hachaya ve'es kol ha'behema asher ito b'teva. God remembers him, and he remembers all of the creatures. Vayaver Elokim ruach al haaretz vayashoku hamayim. And God causes a great wind to pass over the land, and the water begins to abate. Now, what does this remind you of? Take a look at the first chapter of Genesis, the second pasuk, which is in source number 5. The haaretz haisa sohu vavohu v'choshech al pnei sahom v'ruach Elokim merachefes al pnei hamayim. There's the spirit of Hashem that is hovering over the earth. And if you look at Pasuk Gimel, going back to Perek Ches, it says, Vayashuvu hamayim me'al haaretz haloch vashov. The water is evading in a to and fro kind of action, rocking gently back and forth, the way that a person, if you wanted to drain a trough of that has a porous bottom to it, you'd move it back and forth to cause the water to drain. And so what Noach, I think, is doing when he sends out the Orev, when he sends out the raven, he's viewing himself as Hashem's partner in the creation of this new world, and therefore wants to activate on a human scale what God is doing on a divine scale. So he knows that birds sometimes mimic this movement of haloch vashov, going back and forth. So now go back to the statement of Pasuk Ches in Perek Ches. Pasuk Zayin, Vayishalach et ha'orei vayetze yatso vashov. He sends out the raven, and it goes to and fro, almost like the bobbing of the water to and fro as it's abating. So that's one idea of the raven moving back and forth. The raven hovers over the water just like V'ruach Elokim merachefes al pnei hamayim, just like the spirit of Hashem was hovering over the face of the water. But that's precisely why he sends out a blackbird first, because what do we know about the initial stages of creation? The haaretz haisa sohu vavohu v'choshech al pnei sahom. There was just complete chaos and void and darkness on the face of the water. So the raven, being a black bird, represents the darkness that exists at the very, very beginning of creation, before light is created. And then it says, after the spirit of Hashem hovers over the water in darkness, then it says, Vayomer Elokim yihi or, vayihi or. God says, let there be light. So just perhaps Noach was recreating this kind of emanation of light by taking the raven back and then sending the white bird out immediately afterwards. And that's a way of being a portent. Noach knew that eventually the dove would succeed eventually, and that's why he doesn't change to a third bird when the dove comes back. Because after all, the Torah says about light, Vayar Elokim es ha'or ki tov, that God saw the light and behold it was good. So he knew that the dove, which he felt would represent my share in the act of creation, of creating light, would eventually be good. And then we go through the rest of the psukim, and we'll find allusions to subsequent days of creation and what Noach is doing. So he sends out the dove the first time, it comes back. The water is still covering the whole earth. So this idea of the dove coming back because the water is covering the whole earth, that could represent the second day of creation, because the second day of creation is where there's no land. There's no land yet. That God just divided the upper waters and the lower waters, but the water was covering the entire earth. Then he waits 7 days, he sends out the dove a second time, and this time the dove comes back with an olive branch in its mouth. That represents the third day of creation, when Hashem causes land to emerge from the water. And that's Noach's participation in the third day of creation. He then sends out the dove a third time, and when it doesn't return, what does he do? The Torah says that he removed the cover off of the teva. So that was providing illumination for the teva using natural light. So that represents the fourth day of creation, where God creates the luminaries. And then when they finally dock on dry land, and Noach and the animals get off the teva, that represents the fifth and sixth days of creation, with the creation of the birds and the fish and all of the animals on the sixth day, and as well as mankind, emerging into the world. So this is perhaps a way of making sure that creation will not degenerate in the way that it had done previously, because now Noach, recognizing that he needs to reenact creation in some way and be a partner with Hashem in some way in the act of Sheshis Yimei Bereshis, he's now, God, you and I are partners. And if that's correct, then perhaps the reason why the Torah is explaining this to us is the Torah needs to tell us what was rectified in the act of the flood. There were a number of things that were rectified. We know that, according to some Meforshim, seasons were introduced to the world, whereas before the world was always temperate in its climate, and it was always like spring, or always very, very temperate, and man could plant at any time of the year. Now there would be seasons, and there were other things that may have changed in the atmosphere and the environment that caused man to have a shortened lifespan. But one of the things that changes is there's no longer God being the giver and man being the receiver, but now Hashem and man are both creators together of this new world, and Noach now feels that humanity has a greater sense of ownership and responsibility for the world that we have helped Hashem to create. So I think that's one of the things. There's this Latin phrase, Imitatio Dei, which means that it's really a takeoff on the pasuk in the Torah, which says V'halachta bidrachav, that you have to walk in Hashem's ways. And that's really one of the functions of the Torah, is that Hashem gave us a Torah that allows us to be creative, to be givers and doers and makers in this world. And that's why it's so vital for everyone in any stage of their lives to contribute to the building of meaningful structures in life, the building of community, taking pride of ownership in the things that we do build, whether it's our families, our communities, our children, our shuls, our schools. And to whatever extent we participate in the building of structures, of human beings, of cultivating systems within our lives, to be able to say, I made that, it helps us take responsibility for the things that go on all around us. It's one of the sources of angst that young adults or adolescents have in life, is that they don't feel that they've really made anything yet. They want to be adults, but they haven't done anything really meaningful yet in life. And so it's very, very difficult for them to find that voice and to find that place. And then we find, as we begin to create things in life, and we take ownership of the decisions that we make, we become more humble, and at the same time realize the awesome responsibilities that life has for us, and we're able to speak with a much more powerful voice, realizing that we've done more meaningful things in life, and are no longer the taker, but now have the opportunity to be the giver as well. And one of the most powerful, I think from an educational standpoint, one of the most powerful tools that we can provide for our youth are providing them with educational opportunities to help other people. I've always been a big fan of, if you want to turn a young person into a great student, make them a teacher. If you want to be able to get someone to be motivated to learn, have them teach someone else first. And in giving that person that responsibility, you also de facto create that sense of imitatio Dei, of the halachta bidrachav, to walk in Hashem's ways, to help someone else. And when a person acquires that mantle of responsibility and indeed divinity, it makes them into a better person, and it allows them to become a better student in the process. So if you have students, if you have children, if you have grandchildren that are having challenges in their studies, make them a tutor for someone else, and you won't have any problem. I mean, hopefully you won't have any problem. But that's one of the things that I think is one of the lessons that we take out of what Noach was trying to do, was being Hashem's partner in creation, and we should all merit to try to find partnerships with Hashem whenever possible. Have a great day, everyone.